Another important aspect is the fact that he has been continuously funded from NIH since 1986, and currently he holds 5 R1s as a PI. I've been following Dr. Seal's work for many years, ever since I was a graduate student, and also the work of his former trainees, many of which I know very well. And in fact, it was when I was a graduate student at Indiana University in 2004 that we were trying to establish the new measurement of flow-mediated dilation in our laboratory. And in looking through the literature, it became very apparent that Dr. Seal's lab was the leading lab in this area. And he was very kind to allow us visit his laboratory at UC Boulder, where we learned that technique back in 2004. Over the last few years, Dr. Seals has been reflecting on his experiences as a leader and of a research laboratory, and on his experiences as a mentor of the next generation of scientists. And he has been summarizing this important knowledge in a series of papers that are now published in the Journal of Applied Physiology. And today, we will be discussing one of those papers titled "A Biomedical Research Laboratory is Many Things, Including a Small Business." And I know many of you in the audience are graduate students in NEP and have read the paper as well as the other papers. And so we are extremely happy to have Dr. Seals here visiting us at Mizzou again after 10 years from his last visit. And so please join me in welcoming Dr. Seals.
Thank you very much, Jame. I very much appreciate it. I'd also like to start by thanking Jame and Jackie for hosting the visit, for inviting me and being such great hosts, and for Japna and Ben for their administrative support. I very much appreciate all of that. It is a pleasure indeed to be back in my home state. As Jame mentioned, I was born in St. Louis, Missouri, and went all the way through high school there. And then I got a hankering to go west, young man, go west. And I did. I went all the way to Liberty, Missouri, which is a small town near Kansas City. And I went to a small liberal arts school, as Jame mentioned, William Jewell College, still there. I graduated from there and left Missouri for the first time. And I went all the way up to Madison, Wisconsin. I wasn't ready to leave the Midwest, but I was ready to leave Missouri, I guess. And after graduate training there, as Jame mentioned, I came back to St. Louis, and there was a senior professor there in the medical school at Washington University, who many of you will recognize his name, John Hollisey. He was a physician scientist, a great exercise biochemist, and really a very good physiologist. And that's where, as Jame mentioned, I trained in the area of cardiovascular aging. Actually conducted the very first study on the effects of endurance training and on cardiovascular health in older adults there. So I do feel, I actually calculated that I've spent 37% of my life in Missouri. And that I submit that qualifies me as a son of Missouri still. This is my home state, and I'm going to use that as evidence. But it's wonderful to be back, and to be back on the main state university campus. Those of you in the audience, perhaps some of you less than others, may be interested in this title today. Now, this is very different from the kind of title that you see with most seminar speakers in the series, I suspect. And I thought it might be interesting, especially to the early career stage trainees, to know how I came to be here today, giving this particular presentation, as opposed to talking about my own science, which is more of the conventional seminar. And so I'm just going to take a moment and explain how I got and why we're talking about the Biomedical Research Laboratory as a small business. It all really started back in the 1990s. I know that was before many of the folks in the audience were even born, but I've always had an interest in professional research skills and career development for whatever reason. And I noticed that even though I spent a lot of time emphasizing professional skills to the folks in my laboratory that were training in my program, that wasn't the case for all laboratories. Experimental skills seem to be being taught fairly uniformly and effectively. But professional skills varied highly from lab to lab. Some labs spent little or no time mentoring in that area, as opposed to my lab. So I thought, you know, what would be really good if I created a graduate class so that all of the graduate students in the department, not just those in my laboratory, and postdocs, if they wanted to sit in, could be exposed to these professional skills. And so that's what I did. I created what I think is the first 3 credit hour course at the graduate level, probably ever in the United States. And that went online about 1998. I taught it for the first time. And I taught it from then into the 2013s period before I handed it off to someone else, but it's still a core instructional experience for our graduate students. So I had early exposure to thinking about and talking about and sharing those experiences and professional skills. And over the years, I gave talks like this elsewhere from time to time, not on a regular basis. And at some point, I did think about translating this information so that I could share it more broadly. I thought about writing a book, for example, but it never reached threshold. I never took any action on it because, like everybody else, I'm busy writing grants and manuscripts and mentoring and so on. So fast forward to the end of the first year of the pandemic, and I've been asked by the graduate students and postdocs at McMaster University in Ontario to give a talk on career development. And this was by Zoom, of course. It was pandemic, December of 2020. And I gave a presentation on the topic we're going to cover today. And also I included some tips for enhancing career development with graduate students and postdocs. And it went fine. It was well received. I had great questions. Went back to work after the talk. And I received an email from a colleague on the faculty at McMaster that sat in on the seminar. And he really urged me to share the information beyond my lab and beyond the department. And I think that was just the push that I needed to take some action. So I started in February of 2021, started writing, and I decided after a lot of thought that I wasn't going to put it in book form. Instead, I was going to try to publish the information in a series of articles in American Physiological Society journals, my parent discipline organization. And I did this because I wanted the information to be peer reviewed. I didn't want to just publish it in a book that I drove the process with. I wanted it to be peer reviewed, and I wanted it to focus, to target early stage investigators. That's the target audience. And that was an upfront decision. So that's what I did. And the first article that I wrote was, as Jame indicated, in the Journal of Applied Physiology. It was the talk that I'm going to give today. And this kind of got the ball rolling. And then I wrote a second one that I had mentioned. I talked with the McMaster students about tips for enhancing early career stage development. And so that became the substrate for a second commentary. We also use that as a vehicle for our lunch discussions today. And then I kind of got in a rhythm. And the third commentary that I wrote was another viewpoint article, also published in the Journal of Applied Physiology, where I shared my thoughts on mentoring. And that felt really good because I built up a lot of thoughts about that over the years. It was a fairly long perspective. And my fourth one was on grant writing. I have really been fascinated with the art and the science of grant writing and how to do that and how to be effective and how to change with the times. And so my next one was on grant writing, and it was kind of long. So it was broken up into 3 parts. So there are 3 parts about that. There's one, part 3, on writing career development proposals that might be of interest to some of the early career folks in the audience. I next turned my attention to directing an academic research lab. These were a lot of the thoughts that I had beyond what we're going to talk about today. The lab is a small business, and that came out, I believe, in April of this year in AJP Regulatory. I also followed that with a presentation of information on giving oral presentations, giving talks, and how to do that effectively. I believe that was published in June. And then more recently, I think this was just published online in the last 2 weeks, in the Advances in Physiology Education journal. And this was kind of stepping outside of my comfort zone, but I thought it needed to be said, the excessive use of fillers in scientific speech. And if anybody tells me how many I did after this, I'm going to take your name. No, it's fine. And then just to bring you up to date, the perspective that I'm working on now for AJP Regulatory is all about publishing and how to create an effective manuscript for submission for publication. This will probably turn out to be 3 parts. Part 1 is done right now. I'm about 75% of the way through, so you could look for that this fall. But today we're going to come back to the beginning. We're going to talk about this concept of the academic biomedical research laboratory as a small business. And I want to emphasize, for those of you who may not be as familiar with this perspective and the others in the series, I want to emphasize this is my opinion. This is based on my experience, what's worked for me, what makes sense to me, and includes my biases. So no one in the audience is under any obligation to agree with everything I say today, or actually anything that I say today. And same thing for your mentors. I don't know about you, but I really love working in an academic setting. I just love it. And this is sometimes referred to, this academic setting, as the ivory tower. I particularly like working on an academic research campus. I just love the independence and the scholarship and the collegiality and the collaboration and everything that goes with that. And operating a biomedical research laboratory in that setting is just a dream. I couldn't enjoy it more. I wouldn't want to do anything else. And when I start the beginning of an academic year, and I have my new laboratory together with new folks that have just come into the program, I always give sort of a pep talk and my view of the laboratory and the industry and how we think and how we operate. And the first thing I ask the group, it's not really a question, it's rhetorical. What is the mission? What's the mission of the laboratory? And it's twofold, and I emphasize this. It's to conduct high impact original research. Every laboratory has that as a mission. But in our case, I want them to know that we have a co-emphasized mission, a second mission of providing high quality scientific training. And that's on the same par as conducting our original research. And we're going to dedicate ourselves to doing that. I want them to know that up front. And the next thing I tell them is, in addressing that mission, we all agree what a laboratory represents. It does represent different things to different people. And some of the things that it represents are shown here. It represents a professional home, kind of a home away from home. At least it does to me, and I think my trainings. It's a place to come to learn, and that includes me. I come in to learn every day, just like my research trainees, just like my staff. For the research trainees that are actually doing the experiments, now I'm excluded from this part of the presentation, it's a place to conduct experiments. It's a place to perform studies. And it's also a social environment for them. It's a social network that they create. And some of those friendships will last the rest of their lives. So we all agree that the biomedical research laboratory is all these things. But beyond the ivory tower, to me as a laboratory director that carries the responsibilities that I carry, it's also something else. It's a small business. And not only is it a small business, it's a small business in a highly competitive industry. And so what I'm going to do in the minutes that I have remaining today is try to make a case to you that the laboratory is, among many other things, also a small business. And I'll be presenting 4 distinct lines of evidence to try to get you to agree with my position on this. How does that sound? Okay? All right. The first first line of evidence is that if my biomedical research laboratory and yours is truly a small business, among other things, it must produce products and services. That's what small businesses do in the commercial world. And I submit to you that we do indeed meet that criteria. The first product that you could argue that we create are ideas and hypotheses. You may not think of ideas, research questions, scientific hypotheses as being products, but I suggest to you that they are. And they're the first absolutely crucial product that we create. To test those ideas and hypotheses, we must produce another type of product, experimental approaches. And these approaches must have rigor and reproducibility. They must be innovative. They must be novel. And with the experimental approaches that we've created, we can now test our ideas and hypotheses and produce preliminary results. By the term preliminary, you might think, well, that's too soon to be a product. But again, I would contest that. Preliminary results are an essential product that a research laboratory produces. You might think, oh yeah, I guess it is a product because my preliminary results, I use that to write an abstract and go to a scientific meeting and present. And you would be correct. But it's much more than that. Those preliminary results are the substrate that we use when we write manuscripts and submit them for publications to scientific journals. And those preliminary results are critical to develop a competitive biomedical grant application. And these two products, publications and grant applications, are the currency of success in academic research settings. And they never are created without preliminary results. We could go on. There are other products and services that we provide. Think about grant and manuscript reviews that you've been involved in. You've been asked to review a grant. You've been asked to review a manuscript. Your group has been asked to review a manuscript. You are doing a service for the grant organization or the editor of a scientific journal when you engage in that activity. And in fact, the grant review or the manuscript review that you write, that's actually a product. So they're both products and services that you're creating. Again, this is not a comprehensive list. What I'm doing right now, that's a product and a service. I'm performing a service for this group. But my keynote file of slides, that's a product. Again, you could come up with additional products and services. Before leaving this line of evidence, I want to make a few things clear about products and services. Just producing products and services per se, just like in a commercial business, does not allow you to necessarily be successful in your small business. First of all, those products and services have to be produced on a regular basis. If I generate a set of preliminary results, submit a manuscript for publication, and develop a grant application for funding once every 3 years, that's not going to be a production rate that is associated with success, not in this business. So we have to produce products on a regular basis. In many cases, we must meet specific submission deadlines. I can't just submit a research grant anytime. There are very specific deadlines, as most everybody knows. Not so much with manuscripts, but occasionally. Certainly with scientific conference abstracts, those are strict deadlines. So now we must produce these products on a regular basis and in many cases to meet strict production deadlines. But just doing that still is not any assurance of success, because the next point, they must be of high quality. They must be competitive products and services. So I can produce them regularly, I can meet those deadlines, but if they're not competitive, if the manuscript is not competitive for acceptance and publication, if the grant is not competitive for funding, then I still am not going to be successful. Just like the products that are produced by our colleagues in the commercial world. And I'll talk about this in a few minutes with another part of the talk, but it's unnecessary to emphasize that meeting all of these criteria with our products and services takes a sustained professional effort. And again, I'll come back to that. Evidence line number 2. If we are truly a small business, we must have clients for our products and services. So we could meet all of the criteria, check all the boxes that I just talked about in terms of our production. But if there's not a demand for our products, we cannot be successful. Just like the small business owner that produces widgets or whatever, unless there's demand for those widgets or for the tacos that they produce or whatever it is that they provide, then they're not going to be successful. So do we have clients? And I would submit to you again, yes, we have clients, and those clients have demand for our products. So who are those clients? Well, some of the clients are the National Institutes of Health, who fund all biomedical research, major biomedical research, from a federal government source in the country. Industry is another source that has demand for our products. Not every laboratory, but many laboratories. Disease-based research foundations, American Heart Association, American Diabetes Association, Alzheimer's Foundation, and many others. Those are also clients for our products. And they're crucial clients. They're indispensable clients because they fund our research. We must have those clients. Scientific journals are clients. They're clients for our manuscript. If they didn't demand our manuscripts as products, you open up the journal, there would be no content because they depend on us for the content for their journals. So they don't fund our research, unfortunately, and probably unfairly, but that's another story for another day. They publish our research, but they're still a client and they create that demand. And if you're working in small business, you're always interacting with liaisons from whoever you're selling your products to. And I submit that that's also the case in biomedical research laboratories' lives. We deal with purchasing agents all the time. You may not think of them as purchasing agents, but they are. They're peer reviewers and they're administrators. When you submit a grant application, it's reviewed for scientific merit by peer reviewers, and it's handled by program officers at the NIH or the American Heart Association or whoever. So same thing with scientific journals. You deal with editors, you deal with peer reviewers. So this group evaluates and administers our research, but they can't do their job unless we are creating and sharing those products. So this is the second line of evidence that I submit as evidence to the jury out there. Third line of evidence. If we are indeed a business, we need a workforce to generate the products and services that we've been talking about. Now, the term workforce is a little bit controversial. Some people are okay with it. Some people don't like it. They think it's somehow offensive. But I use it here for two reasons. One, it's used in commercial business, and that's the whole point of the discussion today. And secondly, it's used by the National Institutes of Health. They use it all the time. That's their descriptor for personnel, for professionals. And they define it as the population of trained professionals required to support the biomedical research enterprise. So that's why I'm using it today. And I want to talk to you about three aspects of the biomedical laboratory workforce: the composition of the workforce, workforce development, and workforce turnover, because these are all analogous to what happens with the workforce of a commercial small business. Let's start with workforce composition. What are all these images down here? Well, these are all the possible, or at least most of the possible roles that you'll find in a biomedical research laboratory. By definition, there's a laboratory director. That's pretty important to have a lab. There are people undergoing training, undergraduate students. If you have a master's program, there'll be master's students, doctoral students, as those in the auditorium, postdoctoral fellows. junior research faculty, people that are between postdocs and their first tenure track job. And then there's the staff side of things. Some laboratories have laboratory managers, some don't. Many laboratories have some kind of staff research assistant or assistants. And then some may have staff scientists, people that have done their doctoral work, they've performed postdoctoral training, they want to be involved in research and conduct research, but they don't want to direct their own laboratory. And all of these people may or may not be part of your individual lab, because labs differ in the stage of development they're at. We'll talk about that next. And they also differ in size, obviously. So these are more of what is possible to see in terms of workforce roles in a laboratory. But the main thing I want to mention here about the workforce that I'm showing you, describing, is that everyone is essential. So if you run an effective biomedical research laboratory, every person that I show an image here about is essential to the operation of the laboratory. And that's, I think, similar to what the case is in a commercial small business. What about workforce development? When you first start a small business and you first start a biomedical research laboratory, you start building your workforce incrementally. And you may start by recruiting undergraduate students or graduate students. Maybe you'll invest some of your initial funding in a postdoctoral fellow or a laboratory manager, whatever. But you build incrementally through a recruitment process. And once you've recruited a new member of the workforce, of course, they have to be trained, just like they have to be trained in commercial business. They have to be mentored. And they have to be, similar to commercial world, they have to be supervised and managed at some level. And this is typically done by the laboratory director, but also by laboratory managers and other folks. When I wrote this viewpoint in the Journal of Applied Physiology, I was asked by a reviewer, I didn't include this in the original submission, what are the workforce traits that you look for when you're recruiting? And I kind of grudgingly said, okay, well, I need to be responsive to this comment, so I am going to add something. You know, I was trying to be a good citizen, but I really am glad that the reviewer made me do this, essentially, challenged me to do this, because I had to stop and really think about this. You know, it's one of those questions that somebody will ask you out of the clear blue sky, and you're like, I should know that. I mean, I live that. But how do I articulate how I think about that? And so I think it was good for me intellectually to have to stop and do this. And so here's some of the descriptors and some of the thoughts that I came up with, and I'll share them very briefly here. Work ethic, I think, is important. It's kind of a no-brainer. Most of the people, if not everybody in the room, would agree to that. I also think that competitive spirit, it might sound odd, but I have come to believe that this is one of the most important traits for a successful trainee or staff person. I find people that have been engaged in extracurricular activities somehow in life, whether that's sport or something else, turn out to be very good members of the workforce. Probably has something to do with this next term, teamwork. Science is so teamwork oriented now, and the laboratory is so integrative that I think that's a critical trait. Here's something that I never thought about as a young laboratory director or a scientist myself, but attention to detail. You could argue is the single most important feature of a successful research trainee or a staff person. The attention to detail and the precision required in biomedical research, or probably any kind of research, certainly scientific research that we do, is so far beyond any other profession. If you just stop and think about it, at least as great as some professions. I just thought of neurosurgery, and it's probably in the same ballpark. So I should walk back that first description, but there aren't many professions that require the kind of precision that we need. And I think that the best businesses also operate with a strong level of precision. Interestingly, I list intelligence here because it's such, an obvious choice, but I find intelligence to be probably the single most overrated trait in terms of success in research trainees and staff. Nobody will argue that you need a certain amount of intelligence to work in a biomedical research laboratory effectively. But some of the most intelligent people that have walked through the doors of my laboratory in 37 years struggled mightily to complete the most mundane task. And so if you're thinking about developing your own laboratory, and when that graduate application list comes out and you're looking to recruit a master's or a PhD student or whatever, beware. Yes. Is it a trait to go in the weighted equation? Yes. Is it a trait that you should base a decision on? I would suggest no. They have to have these other traits. And of course, integrity is important, research integrity. I don't think anybody would argue with that. Back to the 3 points. What about the last aspect of workforce turnover? Like a small business, people leave, right? I think from my experience as a director of a biomedical research lab, that 95% of the time, they leave for very good reasons. If you're a student, you leave because your degree program has been completed. You graduate. That's good, right? Right? Okay, I needed to see more nods because that should not be a high-level cognitive question. If you're a postdoc or junior research faculty, you've completed your research training, you're ready to move forward. Staff often are provided a new professional opportunity. Maybe they go back into healthcare or they get a better position, a more high-paying or responsible position. So it's usually always good. And so I always stop and try to make this point to you. Even though people leaving is disruptive and inconvenient for you as a laboratory director, and it can cause problems, embrace when people leave for the right reasons. It's hard to do, but I think it's important. Whatever reason they leave for, new people must be brought in and replace them. So you must recruit again. And when these new recruits come in, hopefully that disruptiveness and the inconvenience of the person leaving is short-term, that the new person can come in and seamlessly transition into that new position. And 2 things that I just want to mention, I think the same thing is true in commercial business. I call them transition facilitators. 2 things that can help those transitions: have great standard operating procedures, SOPs in the lab, documented and ready to share, and try to bring the person that's replacing the departing individual, try to bring them in early so that they can take advantage of the experience of the person that will be departing. If you do those 2 things, you can minimize the disruption that occurs when somebody that's been a vital component of the laboratory leaves. Okay, you're doing great. The last line of evidence that I'm going to present to you, I know you're already convinced now. I could probably skip this, but the last line of evidence that I'm going to present is about revenue. All commercial businesses need revenue. It's the lifeblood of a commercial business. And so is, I suggest to you, revenue coming into a biomedical research laboratory. And there are 5 points that I want to make before I leave this line of evidence, and then we'll begin. The first point I want to make is a conceptual point, not a practical point, but a conceptual one. Revenue in a biomedical research laboratory allows you to conduct the science that you should be performing versus the science that you can afford to perform. Does that make sense to you? That's the importance of revenue. We don't choose our research questions and create hypotheses based on what we can do, but what makes the most sense and is the most compelling scientifically. So when you say, well, why do I need revenue? Well, yeah, there's the paying for stuff part. That's the obvious part. But this is another important part that kind of operates below the surface. And that's why I wanted to really emphasize it here. The second point is, just like your personal financial portfolio, you need to diversify your research funding portfolio. And I'll present an example of this, an illustration that will help us walk through that particular suggestion. Same thing with a business, diversify their product production, et cetera. Research trainees supported by their own awards. This is another important aspect, I think, of considering revenue and what we need and how much of it we need. We want research trainees to be supported by their own awards whenever possible. Let me take these second and third ones and use an illustration from the viewpoint that I published. This came up in some of the conversations today. This is a fictitious, some people thought it was actually my grant portfolio. I made this up to be able to be used as an example of an active grant research portfolio, because it has all of the different examples that I wanted to talk about. And it emphasizes this concept of diversifying your revenue streams. Let me set the orientation of the slide for you, right, students? Always describe what the audience is looking at, right? Viewpoint number, whatever, 5. So what you have here are 3 categories. In the gold, these are active awards. So these are grant applications that have been funded, and now the money has been awarded to the laboratory and it's using the money. Here in the light gray are applications that have been reviewed and they've received fundable scores, but they haven't been funded yet. So they haven't been awarded, but they will be. And farther up in the pipeline, in the darker gray here, are applications that have been submitted, grant applications that have been submitted that are currently in peer review. So we don't know if they're going to be funded or not. But it represents some of the stages that you have to have in your portfolio. Active awards, awards that are awaiting funding to replace active awards that will run out. And then further up in the pipeline, applications that are going to be reviewed that then can take the place of the applications in the light gray. And we could keep going upstream, right? Preliminary results, ideas, whatever is upstream, farther in the pipeline. You get the idea. And then we can look at diversity across the different columns. So for example, award types. An R01 award is a large award from the National Institutes of Health. An R21 is a pilot grant award that you can receive from NIH. I've listed a variety of different types of awards to support junior research faculty, postdocs, so on and so forth. That's something that you ideally have in your grant portfolio, a diversity supplement off one of the NIH grants for underrepresented students and postdocs. And then subcontracts. So how is a subcontract a revenue stream? Well, that's when you're a co-investigator on somebody else's grant award, and they put the salary and some of the fringe benefits of the co-investigator, and your laboratory is doing some kind of work, maybe an assay or whatever. So the cost of conducting the part of the research plan that you're responsible for, that's revenue that's coming into your laboratory. And the savvy laboratory director that has natural collaborations develop over time needs to be mindful of this as another revenue stream in the lab. Funding agencies are examples of diversity, whether it's NIH or the American Heart Association or different institutes within the 27 institutes, centers, offices, whatever it is, of the NIH, diversifying the institute that you're receiving the funding from. Who's the PI? There's diversity there. It may be the laboratory director for these main R01 grants or R21 grants, but then for the Research Career Development Awards, it is fellows, grad students, research faculty, so on. The funding period is another reflection of diversity. Here's a fictitious 12-year period, 2016 to 2028. These are the years that span the awards that I made up over here. I also made up their funding periods. And you can see that up to about 2022, a span of around 5 years, we have funding in some years through some awards and other years through other awards. That's the kind of overlap that you really want. But looking forward, we need to cover these other years, right? So these grants, these applications that are pending funding, they cover a little bit more of the distant future. And those farther up in the pipeline, if they are truly accepted, given good priority scores and funded eventually, they will cover most of the rest of this interval. So all these are reflections of diversity, and they also emphasize the third point in that revenue stream slide that we'll come back to in a moment, and that is that the importance of having your research trainees, whenever possible, supported by their own funding, so that the R01 awards, the large awards to support research projects, not scientific training, but research projects, can be used to support the PI salary, the staff salaries, buy supplies, small equipment, all of those costs. You can free those awards up by making sure that you emphasize fellowship funding and other kinds of funding to support scientific training of your research mentees. Okay, we're back to the list. Number 4, we're getting there. Proactive competitive grant submission plans and execution. I'm a strong believer in planning. I'm a little obsessive about organization, and this probably reflects that. This came up also at lunch today. Somebody remembered the following illustration. This is not my laboratory's annual research plan. Sorry, somebody brought that up, but it's not dissimilar. I made it up. It's fictitious. It's not mine, but it's reasonably close. Again, I selected content to provide different examples and give us the diversity that we're talking about. But what you're looking at is the annual laboratory grant submission plan for some calendar year, whatever calendar year you want. And the far left column is simply submission deadlines, and they're listed in chronological order from the first NIH grant deadline, typically, if it's a conventional mechanism. And I brought it all the way to September 1st, and I ran out of space. So if you're wondering why I stopped at September 1st, it's nothing more esoteric than just simply running out of space. And then the grant agency that we've identified for submitting an award on that February 16th deadline, or whatever it is shown here. Again, you can see the diversity of the institutes that we've targeted. Grant mechanism, what kind of grant mechanism? Like we talked about on the other illustration, is it an NIH R01 grant application? Is it a junior faculty development award, which is what a K01 is? Is it a fellowship application? So on and so forth. The review group. So if you've targeted an NIH study section, or I think initial review group is the proper term, you know, what are those review groups? You want to diversify where your grant applications go in some cases. In others, you find a study section that really likes your science that you propose, you might want to stay with them. But there are different review groups that are options on the table. Your research project, and here's where I just went hog wild with imagination. I just put every topic I could think of, so there's no similar topic. But you know, your research projects will obviously each have different focuses. And then again, the diversity that you see in terms of who will be the principal investigator, will be the lab director, will be a research trainee, so on and so forth. These plans I submit to you, respectively, must be ambitious. They should intentionally be ambitious, aggressive. They also must be dynamic. Why? Because the way things work in this business is a grant possibility, they call them funding opportunity announcements, or FOAs. They come out periodically through a calendar year. So it's December, you have your grant plan all set up, you've shared it with your research trainees or staff, and people have approved it, and you go into the new year, and all of a sudden, NIH announces in early February that it's going to have a new funding opportunity announcement that is due, your application would be due on the 1st of April. And it's something that's really a good fit for your lab. And you didn't know it when you made the plan. So when I say dynamic, this is a living document. And so what happens? That gets slotted into April 1st, and this April 15th gets moved down the road. And so you need that kind of flexibility, I suggest. The nature of the applications that are in the plan, again, both are research revenue aimed applications that support the projects in the laboratory, and also those that support scientific training. There must be a balance. That's kind of what I've been preaching the last few minutes. And most importantly, you could be the world's greatest organizer, and you could be as aggressive as heck, and you could be dynamic and flexible, but you got to execute. So if you're making plans and you're not following through with the plan, then the plan's not very valuable. Am I saying that you make a plan, and unless something like I mentioned happens, a new funding opportunity, you've got to get every application in? No, I'm not saying that. It's a plan, and it's just a plan, and it's an ambitious plan. But what I would suggest is that you should be looking at something like 75% of what's on that plan. If it's not tangible enough, it's not feasible enough to be able to be involved in that kind of success in terms of executing the plan, then it shouldn't be on the plan. So we routinely are able to get about 75% of the grants that are on the plan. But whether you agree with that percentage or not, the point is you must execute the plan. That's really the bottom line. And finally, for those of you that are dozing, I really believe in this concept that I call pay it forward. You've heard the term before, so it's me using the term rather than the term as you've heard it before. But this concept of pay it forward is very important in my view. It involves vetting new research ideas, not only for their scientific potential, but their funding potential. And really the whole pay it forward idea has as its essential goal to optimize the investment of your limited resources. We all have limited resources, whether you're a large laboratory that's well-funded, you're a beginning laboratory, you're a mid-career laboratory, small, medium size, we all have limited resources. So one of the challenges must be, how do you most effectively use those limited resources? And this is all about persuading you to adopt, create, adopt, borrow some kind of process that allows you to optimize the investment of your limited resources. Here's our process. The first one on the left is the pitch. The research trainee comes into my office and makes a pitch for a new research project. Might be their dissertation, might be a postdoctoral fellow with an idea on what they want to do. Might be a second project. They were brought in to do a primary project, and they come in after 9 months and say, I want to start a second project. Whatever it is, I might have a research trainee come in because I have an idea and I'm doing the pitching. Whatever the case is, the two of us or the three of us, or whoever it is, we pitch back and forth and we look at it and we go away and we do some more homework and we come back. And at some point we make a call. This is ready or not to move forward as an idea. And if it is ready to move forward an idea, if it has a sufficient feasibility in our minds, then we present it to the entire lab. We have a 2-hour laboratory meeting journal club every week, and all research ideas before they're agreed upon must be presented to the entire group. That helps us vet the idea, evaluate the idea, and it allows people that are on the staff side and research trainees of all levels to have the experience of, in their minds, going through a possible project and evaluating that project. There is no better experience for when they go forward and they're directing a lab or they're directing a division of some organization. It's a process that everyone must do at some point. If they're successful, they will be in a position like that. And after the lab discussion, we try to work toward a consensus. It may sound strangely democratic to you, but if you're going to involve people, if you're going to approach things in this way, then people must have a voice, and that voice must have merit. So we decide as a group if we're going to invest in that project or not. And the person who came up with the idea is sitting in there. They know. They know what's going on, and they've accepted that this is the process, and their project will either make it through or they won't make it through. But it's good for everybody. And then what we're seeking on this far right end, as it says, are high return investments. What does that mean? That means we're going to get a high return on using our limited resources to fund that idea from both a scientific perspective and a funding perspective. It's going to meet both of those expectations. And I submit to you that that's really the only way having a process like this, doesn't have to be this process, but some kind of rigorous process for you to sustain a laboratory in this business. And that's how it is in the commercial world. People make product pitches to their bosses. It goes to a larger group. The group either decides to fund it or not to fund it as an investment of the company's resources. And it must make a profit down the road. It must be a successful product, or at least a percentage of all of those possible products must be successful. You're not going to hit on everything. Same thing with us. We're not going to hit on every idea, even those that make it through this gauntlet of steps. But now the point is, we have the funding for the next great idea. And that's really the key that I'm trying to emphasize here. That you have some process that will sustain the quality of the science and the assurance of the revenue in a laboratory. Okay. Thank goodness, right? Summary and discussion. I tried to emphasize early on, and hopefully did, that a biomedical research laboratory is a lot of things to different people. I think we could all agree on that. But to someone who's directing a laboratory, just like a manager or a division head or whatever it is, as an analogy in the commercial business world, we are a small business and we are in a competitive industry with the smartest people in the room. That's who we're competing against. So we must, among all of those other things we must act like a successful small business. We must think about what we can learn from being a small business. We must produce quality products and services on a regular basis. We must identify clients for our products and services. We must create, train, and sustain, sometimes replace, members of a very good workforce. And to be successful, ultimately, we need revenue. And we must maintain our focus on revenue. And I really appreciate your patience. Happy to take questions. This is Boulder and the University of Colorado at Boulder. And thank you very much. Didn't need the lodging, but I had the lodgings. So.
We have about 4 to 5 minutes for questions. Great talk about sales.
Yeah.
So scale here analogy. See that a lot of labs operate on. Would it be, beneficial
So are you sorry, I just want to make sure I understand the question. Talking about within a laboratory or within a laboratory? Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, that is something that I promote in my laboratory, that everybody is essential and their voices are essential and their ideas are essential. And we do run the laboratory kind of as a group governance model. And again, it's a win-win, because if I have a query that I've been sent, I have a decision to make, whether it's short-term or long-term, whatever it is, I have faith in the people that I've brought in and that we as a laboratory is trained. I won't suggest that I've trained everybody in every facet of things, certainly not. But we brought those folks in, we value their opinion, we value the professional that they're developing into, their capability and their capacity to add something to the conversation that is important, maybe crucial. And so that's one reason why we have this shared governance model. Of course, the bottom line is I would have to make the final decision, of course, but in terms of what you consider, everyone is involved. And then the second thing, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, the experience that they get from me asking them to be involved in all of these kinds of decisions. Sometimes the decisions are scientific, what to invest in. We just talked about that. Sometimes they're administrative. Sometimes they're financial. Again, we share our finances with the group. We want them to know how much it costs to run this laboratory. We have a talk, and that pep talk that I mentioned that I give at the beginning of every year, after I'm done framing all this stuff that we're talking about and a few other things, my lab manager comes up to the front and goes, I'm going to tell you about how the lab finances work. So you've got undergrads in there, you have people in there, and they understandably don't stop and think about where the money comes from. And so we present the cost of doing business, and we go through all of the salaries and how much the TA, the teaching assistant stipend, pays and what it doesn't pay, what we need to pick up, and the cost of postdocs and staff and so on and so forth. The cost of experiments. Our clinical research center is a fee-for-service center, I think maybe like yours is. How much does it cost when the clinical research center does a glucose tolerance test for us? So we talk about all that, and you just have these mouths drop. I mean, just these gaping looks, because they have no idea. It's $1 million or whatever for us. I think now, if you consider all the salaries, we're at like $1.5 million. And they're just dumbstruck by it. Again, understandably, right? But I want them to be savvy. I want them to understand that part of it. And then she shifts, the lab manager, and she talks about our revenue streams and how the revenue streams stack up against the expenditures. And we purposely do that. So it is a governance. And I think for those reasons, and probably more that we could figure out, it's highly successful. And when people walk out of the program, they're savvy. I mean, I'm sending out postdocs into the faculty world, and they'll call me back and say, there are associate professors in the department that don't understand X, Y, or Z. And I think part of it, or grad students going into postdoc settings, whatever the case is, I think they just haven't been exposed to what we're talking about, professional skills and career development. And it's more than just experimental skills. We were talking about this afternoon. It's so much more. Because if you have to compete against other very capable people, and it's only on the basis of experimental skills, everybody's going to get the same grant scores. Everybody's going to publish papers at the same rate in the same quality journals. But what distinguishes you, I submit, this is just me, I'm still editorializing, it's the professional skills that separate people, because the experimental skills aren't that different. Yeah, they're not exactly the same. Some people have experimental skills that provide an advantage for a little while, but with open science, how long is that skill going to give you an advantage? Because Sally down, the road at St. Louis University, she's in the med school, she's got that skill now, and Joe somewhere else has the skill. So that it's not like the old days, I suggest to you, where you could really, people guarded their skills. With open science, that has really reduced the distinctiveness that's created by the experimental skills that you have or the laboratory has.
And I will add that you can't give a talk if you don't have data. So, and people can see that.
Oh, yeah.
I had a student 10 years ago who just wanted to give talks all the time. And I said, you need it in the lab. You need it. It comes after that skill, right? You can't.
Yeah. I mean, we have to acquire and analyze data. We must perform original research, but there's a lot more than that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I have a quick question?
Sure.
The role of solving good child. If you have good revenue, you can do a lot of things. Sometimes when you have small revenue, some things start to compete with each other. It's kind of like I'm out like at a restaurant. I'm very good at making dinner, but not making breakfast. So I make breakfast and just serve dinner. And I suggest that part of the products that we make are people who are trained to be the same as we are, or competitors if you like. Which is a little bit different. Restaurant, I'm not forming people to make a restaurant on the street and compete with it. So then at some point, this balance is a little complicated. How much do I invest in the science that is going to get me there? How much I invest in my forming people?
Yeah. No, I think that's a very valid concern, and it is a challenge that we all face, especially if you're training postdoctoral fellows, because they're once our junior research faculty, because they're just one step away from starting their own laboratory if they don't go into industry or something else. I try to work that out up front and be very open and transparent as we go through. If they've created that project idea and they've really done a good job of developing it in my laboratory, and we have supported that work, my goal is to create funding while they're in my laboratory for the lab to support that work. So that's revenue that's coming into my lab. They are responsible for working with me to get their own independent funding. When they leave with the assurance that they can continue that line of investigation. And if those lines of separation between what we plan to do in the future related to that scientific direction, if it's cloudy in terms of how it might overlap with theirs, then we talk about it. But my experience is actually, we have very few conversations along that line, because we've interacted so much and talked about the science that it's clear in our respective minds how we're going to go forward. Sometimes when they leave, that's it for us. We've already created 2 new scientific directions to fill that gap. And, we welcome them to take that and run with it. But I don't personally have any problems with that. I know that theoretically this comes up. I know people have had some bad experiences. I'm not saying who's at fault there. It's probably different in each situation, and it is tricky. So I think it's a great question, but that's how I handle it.
Very much for all your thoughts.
It's also a product.
My question is, we thought about how capital assets fit in in an academic institution, an opportunity or a cost of capital. So there's a lot of things we can use. We can't save and invest to buy technology.
Yeah, that's a great question. I thought where you were going was commercialization of our research, but capital assets, yeah, you can't hold on to things. You have to spend your money, right? So this investment process that I described, that, suggesting that you need something like it, it's a dynamic process. And you're exactly right. We can't put money away. Well, you can if you get donations or certain things like that, but mostly we're using grant funding, and it's just this dynamic, continuing, hopefully sustainable process. And so I guess it does deviate in that way certainly from corporate business. You're right. Okay, Jackie? Yeah, so that's right.
In class, we talked about clients also being patient advocacy groups or support groups, kind of asking the community what type of research you might want as a client. I don't know if you've done that at all. Seeing the patients you serve as a client.
Yeah, and that graph or the image that I showed you about clients, those are examples. So you're absolutely right. When I wrote this review, or this perspective, one of the reviewers said, well, with open science, isn't society your client? And I said, yes. And I think it's in there somewhere, actually. After I describe I didn't describe everything here, obviously, for time, but I do talk about society being a client. And a patient group could be a client, just like you talked about. So you could make a lot of different examples. One person said, one reviewer said, well, aren't the people that we mentor and that come out of our laboratories, aren't they products? Because now they fill a postdoctoral slot in somebody else's laboratory. Yes, they're performing scientific training for themselves, but they are also a product in the sense that they fill a position in somebody else's laboratory, or they take a faculty position. They finished a postdoc with us or junior research faculty appointment, and now they're filling a laboratory position or a faculty position somewhere. So yeah, I think there are lots of examples of other products and services that we provide as biomedical research laboratories. It's kind of fun to think about, I think.
All right, we ran out of time. Please join me. Thank you.
Thank you very much.